My name is Dave Collins, and I served 22 years in the United States Army. Most of that time, I walked the quiet line, the kind of service that didn't make headlines or recruiting posters. Logistics, convoy security, disaster relief, training younger soldiers how to keep their heads when the radios cut out and the world goes sideways. Nothing glamorous, nothing loud, but always necessary. I never expected medals for doing my duty. I never expected applause for choosing steadiness over glory. All I ever hoped for, all I ever prayed for, was to be a good father. And that's why what happened at my daughter's wedding, well, it sits in me like shrapnel that never worked its way out. Not because it hurt my pride. I've had that kicked around enough times to know it survives, but because it told me something I wasn't ready to hear. Some battles don't happen overseas. Some battles happen in the places you love most. The wedding was held at the Harbor Point Country Club, the kind of place where the chandeliers sparkle just a little too loudly, and the carpet looks like it has never forgiven a footprint. I wore my best suit, navy, freshly pressed, and the tie my daughter gave me back when she still brought home drawings of stick figure families and wrote "Daddy" in crooked letters. I arrived early. Habits like punctuality never leave you. I checked every box in my mind the way I always did before a mission. Gift wrapped, yes. Speech prepared, yes. Hands steady, as steady as a man's hands can be when he's about to see his only daughter in a wedding dress. The first hour passed quietly. People mingled, the photographer barked instructions, and the catering staff marched back and forth like their own little platoon. I kept to the side, watching, waiting, not wanting to be in the way. Then came the introductions. A woman from the groom's side, his aunt, I think, smiled at me and said, "And you must be the bride's father?" Before I could answer, my daughter stepped in, heels clicking like punctuation marks. "Yep," she said, rolling her eyes. "This is my useless old father, too lazy to work a real job." The laugh she gave afterward, light, careless, practiced, sliced deeper than any knife I'd been trained to handle. The group erupted, some with polite chuckles, some with belly laughs, some with that nervous sound people make when they don't know if a joke is appropriate, but they commit anyway. A few tried to hide their smiles behind champagne flutes. I felt the heat crawl up my neck. For a moment I was back in Afghanistan, standing in the open with no cover. Only this time it wasn't gunfire I was trying to survive. It was humiliation handed to me by my own flesh and blood. She didn't look at me. Not once. She just turned, arm looped through her fiancé's, and kept talking to the guests like she hadn't just swept my dignity off the table. I didn't move, didn't speak. Years of discipline held me still. A good soldier knows when silence is the strongest shield. But the room changed. I felt it before I saw it. 4 young men, the groomsmen, stopped laughing. Their backs straightened, their faces tightened in the way I knew too well. Recognition memory, loyalty awakening. I knew all 4 of them, not socially, not as friends. I knew them because they had once stood under my command. Afghanistan, convoy Delta, June heat that made your weapon feel like it was burning your palms. These men had followed my voice through roads where one wrong turn meant a folded flag for someone's mother. They set their glasses down, not loudly, not dramatically, just with purpose. One of them, Staff Sergeant Reed, stepped forward slightly and addressed my daughter with the same tone he used when addressing a superior. "Miss," he said, voice steady as a level line. "He is our commanding officer." The other 3 echoed it together, like a formation responding to a call. "He is our commanding officer." The room froze. Forks hovered midair. Someone gasped. The laughter collapsed like a tent whose poles had been yanked out. My daughter's face drained of color. The groom stared, baffled, and suddenly every eye turned not to them, but to me. I didn't lift my chin. I didn't smile. I didn't reclaim the space she had stripped from me. I simply stood there, the way I had stood 1,000 times in uniform. Quiet, steady, present. Because respect doesn't need volume, and truth doesn't need permission. That was the moment the wedding changed. That was the moment everything changed, and it was only the beginning. People often assume that service shapes you only in the battlefield, But the truth is simpler and far quieter. It shapes how you stand, how you speak, how you hold yourself when the room tilts. As I stood there in that ballroom with my daughter's cruel words still hanging like heavy smoke, I knew the wedding guests saw only the embarrassment of an aging father who had somehow become the punchline of his own family. What they could never have understood was that the steadiness they saw in me had been earned across years, through dust storms, night patrols, and long hours guiding younger soldiers who looked to me as if I had all the answers. I didn't have all the answers. I just had the responsibility to act as if I did. My daughter Melissa had never understood that. She was born during my second deployment, and for years her childhood was shaped by my comings and goings. I tried to make every return soft and gentle, bringing back small gifts from the PX or little carved trinkets I picked up near the bases overseas. But even then I could see the distance growing between us. Children don't understand words like mission, rotation, or operational necessity. All they know is that one parent leaves and the other stays, and the leaving becomes a stain they can't always identify. When she was young, she clung to me with the fierce loyalty only a child can give. But as she reached her teenage years, I saw something else creeping in, a doubt, an irritation, the subtle flinch that appears when a child realizes their parent might not be the hero they once imagined. Her mother did what she could, but our marriage had its own cracks. I was home, then gone, then home again, each return feeling slightly more out of sync than the last. By the time Melissa turned 16, her mother and I had separated quietly, choosing civility over constant arguments. Melissa stayed with her mother, and although I visited as often as I could, she learned to associate me with absence rather than presence. It wasn't her fault. It wasn't mine either. Life makes its own decisions sometimes. During those years my career moved forward. I became a senior NCO and led convoy teams through the kinds of missions most people only read about in military memoirs. We handled evacuations during floods, escorted supply trucks through hostile terrain, and trained new recruits who were barely old enough to shave, but held more courage in their bones than they realized. I grew into the kind of leader who commanded through steadiness rather than volume. My soldiers trusted me because I never asked them to do anything I wouldn't have done myself. I learned their stories, their fears, their strengths. I knew which soldier needed a firmer tone and which one needed a quiet word in the hallway. All of that mattered. That was the real work. But back home, Melissa saw none of it. She saw me as a man who had chosen the Army over birthdays, over dance recitals, over the small, everyday moments that children store inside themselves as proof they mattered. When she started college, she introduced me to her new friends as, "My dad, he's retired military." But she said it with a tone that hovered between dismissal and faint embarrassment. As though military service were a quirky habit she wished I would outgrow, I never corrected her. I didn't want to embarrass her. I wanted her to build a life she was proud of. What she never understood was that I had built my life around being dependable, not impressive. Dependability doesn't sparkle. It doesn't dazzle. It looks like long nights, worn boots, and doing the right thing when it would be easier not to. I suppose that isn't the kind of story that plays well in college dorm rooms or office Christmas parties. So I let her believe what she wanted. I let her talk over me, dismiss me, reshape my life into a narrative that fit the image she thought the world respected. What mattered to me was that I could still show up for her. That is why I made certain nothing kept me from her wedding. I left early, checked my route twice, polished my shoes, rehearsed a short toast that I hoped would feel sincere, but not heavy. I knew there would be guests who judged me by my modest suit and plain manner. But I didn't care. I only cared that she saw me there, present, steady, offering her the version of myself I had tried to give all her life. I did not expect her to introduce me the way she did. I did not expect to stand there surrounded by strangers, hearing her voice wrap around me like barbed wire. But as those cruel words landed, I understood something with a clarity that almost made the moment bearable. She had created her own version of me, one shaped by absence, resentment, and assumptions she never challenged. And she spoke from that version, not the truth. What she never imagined was that the truth would speak back, not through me, through the very men who had once trusted me with their lives. The moment they rose to defend me did more than save my dignity. It forced me to confront the years of distance between my daughter and me, and to finally face the question I had avoided for so long. Had my service protected her, or had it cost me the relationship I most wanted to preserve? The answer wouldn't come easily. It would unfold slowly, painfully in the days that followed. But that night, in that ballroom, I realized one simple truth. Respect can disappear, but it can also be reclaimed. Sometimes it just takes the right witnesses. When the groomsmen spoke up in my defense, the entire room seemed to stop breathing. Even the band on the far stage, halfway through tuning their instruments, went quiet as if some instinct whispered that something sacred had just shifted in the air. I stood very still, trying to understand what had just happened, while Melissa stared at the men she had laughed with only minutes earlier. It was the first time I had seen her look genuinely unsure in years. She opened her mouth once, as if to say something, but no words came. Before the moment could stretch into something even more painful, the wedding coordinator hurried over to usher people toward their seats, pretending nothing unusual had happened. Dinner proceeded, but everything felt slightly off-kilter. Conversations were quieter, more cautious, and every now and then someone's eyes drifted toward me, trying to reconcile the image they had been given. Useless old father, with the one standing quietly at the back of the room, quietly acknowledged by 4 decorated soldiers. Melissa kept her distance, sticking close to her new husband, who looked caught between confusion and worry. He avoided my eyes entirely, which I didn't blame him for. He hadn't asked for any of this. I stayed where I always stayed when things got tense, out of the way, where I could observe without interfering. Years of working convoy security had taught me that the safest place often wasn't the most visible one. I watched the speeches, the clinking glasses. The first dance I clapped politely when expected. But inside, something heavier than embarrassment had settled. It was a sadness I couldn't explain, not because she joked at my expense, but because she seemed to believe the joke. Toward the end of the night, one of the groomsmen, Reed, approached me quietly. He shook my hand with a grip far stronger than necessary, though I could tell it wasn't meant to impress me. It was meant to communicate something without words. I remembered him from our deployment, a young soldier who doubted himself but never shirked responsibility when it was asked of him. He had matured into a good man. "Sir," he said quietly, "I'm sorry for what she said. We didn't think it was right." "You didn't need to step in," I replied, though I was grateful more than I could say. "With respect," he said. "Yes, we did." He hesitated for a moment, then added, "You were the one who kept us steady. We weren't going to let anyone pretend you're anything less than a leader." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. When he walked away, I stood alone for a long moment, letting the gratitude settle like dust after an explosion. When you spend years leading soldiers, you don't expect their loyalty to follow you into civilian life. But sometimes it does. And when it does, it humbles you in ways rank never could. When the night finally ended, guests trickled out, murmuring polite goodbyes. I waited until most had left before approaching Melissa. She was gathering her things, her bouquet wilted at the edges, and her hands trembling slightly. Whether from the long day or from the moment earlier, I couldn't tell. I didn't try to lecture her or make her feel worse. I simply said, "Congratulations, I hope you have a happy life with him." She looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing a person she wasn't expecting to find. There was confusion in her eyes and something else I couldn't name. Maybe guilt, maybe resentment, maybe both. She swallowed hard and nodded. "Thank you," she said, her voice small, almost unfamiliar. I left quietly, walking out into the cool night air, grateful to escape the weight of all those eyes. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few cars scattered under the yellow pool of the lamps. I sat in my truck for a long moment before turning the key, letting the silence settle. Weddings are supposed to mark beginnings, but I felt something ending as I sat there. A chapter of my relationship with Melissa, perhaps, or simply my hope that she understood me better than she did driving home. I replayed the moment over and over, wondering how far back the misunderstanding went. Had I failed her by being gone too often? Had she built an image of me pieced together from her mother's frustrations, her own disappointments, and the stories she invented to explain them? Or had I simply assumed that being present for the big moments could erase the small absences that had accumulated like grains of sand inside her? When I reached home, the house felt too quiet. I hung my suit jacket over a chair and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the dark window. It was strange how silence could feel louder than a firefight when it demanded you confront things you had avoided. I realized then that the wedding wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning of a reckoning between a father and a daughter who no longer understood each other, between the man I had been in uniform and the man she believed I was out of it. And as painful as the night had been, some part of me knew this truth. You cannot rebuild what you will not face. The next chapter of my life, and hers, would depend on whether we were willing to face each other honestly at last. The morning after the wedding arrived quietly, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel peaceful but instead presses on the chest like a weight you're not sure how to shift. I brewed a pot of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the steam curl upward as if it had somewhere purposeful to go. I didn't. Not yet. My mind was still sifting through the night before, replaying the moment Melissa's words cut through the room, the moment the groomsmen rose, the stunned silence that followed, and the hollow echo that stayed with me after the laughter had died. For most of my life, I had relied on structure to move forward. Wake at this hour, train at that hour, brief your team, review your route, execute the mission. But civilian life offers no such manual. There is no guidebook for being a father to a grown daughter who barely recognizes the man standing in front of her. I sat there, hands wrapped around a mug that had gone warm instead of hot, and wondered whether I should reach out to her or give her space. The instinct to close distance is strong in a father, especially one who has spent decades teaching others to move toward problems rather than away from them. Before I could decide, my phone buzzed. A text message. One word. Dad? It startled me more than it should have. Melissa hadn't called me Dad in a long time. David? My father? Him? But rarely Dad. I stared at the screen for a moment, then typed back, I'm here. She called almost immediately, her voice small, the way it had been when she was a child trying to explain a broken glass or a scraped knee. Can we talk? She asked. We agreed to meet at a cafe halfway between our homes. When I arrived, she was already there, sitting with her hands clasped tightly enough that her knuckles had gone pale. She looked up when I approached, and for the first time in years, I saw traces of the little girl who used to run to me in excitement every time I walked through the front door in uniform. Dad, she said again, as if testing the word, I owe you an apology. I sat down slowly, not wanting to rush her. I remembered too well how fragile conversations could be when built on unspoken years. She took a breath, eyes fixed on the table. I was wrong. I shouldn't have said what I did. I don't know why I thought it was funny. I guess I've been telling myself a version of you that made sense to me. She swallowed. But last night, when those men stood up for you, I realized I don't actually know you the way I thought I did. The honesty in her voice felt like a door opening. Cautiously but intentionally, I didn't rush in. I wanted her to keep going. I grew up feeling like you chose the army over us, she continued. Mom never said it outright, but she was always tired, always frustrated, and I put the blame in the only place that made sense every time you left. I told myself it was because you didn't want to be home. And the older I got, the easier that story became to believe I never questioned it. She looked up then, eyes damp. I'm sorry for that. Truly. I felt something shift in me, a mixture of sorrow and relief. Melissa, I said gently, I never wanted distance between us, but I knew my job took me away more than either of us wanted. I thought being steady when I was home would make up for being gone when I wasn't. I see now that it didn't always work the way I hoped. She nodded, and for a moment neither of us said anything. The silence didn't feel heavy this time. It felt possible. Those men last night, she said quietly, they looked at you like you were someone important, someone they trusted. I just did my job, I replied, same as any soldier, but they were good men. I tried to lead them well, that's all. She took another breath, deeper this time. I didn't know you were their CO. I didn't know you trained people. I didn't know half of what you did. I guess I never asked. And I didn't volunteer much, I admitted. I thought keeping the hard stories away from home was the right thing, but maybe sharing more would have helped you understand why I was gone. She reached across the table then, not dramatically, not with any big emotional gesture, just enough for her hand to touch my wrist. Can we start over? She asked. I felt something soften in me that had been rigid for years. We can start wherever you want, I said. We talked for almost 2 hours. Not about deployments or medals or regrets, but about ordinary things. Her work, her plans, the small details of her life I had missed. When we stood to leave, she hesitated before hugging me. It wasn't perfect, not yet, but it was a beginning, and beginnings matter. That evening as I drove home, I realized something I had forgotten somewhere along the way. Service doesn't end when you hang up the uniform. It just shifts. It becomes quieter, more personal. It becomes the work of showing up, of listening, of trying again even when you've been misunderstood. At the wedding, I had been introduced as useless, but the truth stood for itself when those men rose to their feet. And now, standing on the other side of the hardest conversation my daughter and I had ever had, I understood something else. Respect can be lost, found, rebuilt, and finally shared. The uniform may no longer hang in my closet, but the values it gave me still guide everything I do. And as Melissa and I walked towards something better, I felt the quiet certainty that had carried me through every deployment. Some battles are worth fighting, not because they promise victory, but because they protect the people we love. And this one, this last quiet battle, was finally over.